Hi there, and I am glad that you tuned in for the last lecture for our Youth Ministry 305 class. I hope that you've had a good semester, and really what I'm hoping to do here is just to overview some of the main topics that we've covered with a couple notes just for a little bit of a refresher. And then I'm going to explain the final assignment once again, and I'm hoping some of the concepts that I review might be a good refresher for some ideas that might make it into your final assignment. So if you remember back to the very beginning, we talked about how do we define youth ministry. And I spent a decent amount of time by throwing out a suggestion that we might define youth ministry as the ongoing discipleship of teenagers today by followers of Jesus walking with them. And every single word in that definition had a very specific purpose. So the very beginning where it says ongoing discipleship, that really, if I was to boil it down to one word of what we want to do in youth ministry, at least the way I look at it, it would be discipleship. And I talked about discipleship in a couple different ways, and looking at Matthew 28:19 and 20, I thought, this is a pretty good way to look at it, just in a nutshell, that any disciple is someone who's been baptized or is entered into a relationship with God, is the first part. Second part is that they have been taught. The third part is that they are obeying. And the fourth part is that they're experiencing the presence of God. So they are baptized, they're taught, they're learning to obey, and they understand the presence of God in their life. And that any disciple would have all four of those marks at minimum. There's other things there would be too, but those would be four things to look at. And it's not only that at a certain place in time, but the ongoing discipleship of young people. And then I mentioned teenagers today. So youth ministry covers a broader age range, which is called adolescence usually. But what we talked about specifically more in our class is about teenagers, being that we are going to talk about primarily the work that happens with junior high students in high school. Meanwhile, understanding that adolescence has now grown to be a much broader topic area and study area, and it's important to know all of that, as independence and things like that really are getting pushed way into the 20s, but we really dialed in on what teenagers are like today. So there's two components. One is the biological aspect that comes with things like puberty, and how that's actually been getting younger and younger over the last decades and centuries, but also that culture and independence. So our textbook talked about that adolescence could really say that it begins in biology and ends in culture, or possibly even kind of begins roughly with puberty and ends with bringing on culture into their life and their own independent experience of culture and who they want to be. Then I said that this is done by followers of Jesus. And so in every class, we took a little bit of time to hear a devotion from each one of us, because I wanted to emphasize that if you try to do all these things in youth ministry, apart from a relationship with Christ, you can be really busy and you can probably accomplish a lot of things, but that those in youth ministry who are going to really do it the way it's meant to be done, it's going to be done by people who are following Jesus, not perfect people, not big people who have it all figured out, but people who are saying, I do want to keep following you and I want to grow in you. An idea would be like in John 15, to stay connected to the vine and to abide in Christ. So youth ministry is done by those people, and this is done primarily through the means of walking with them. That's another understanding of what discipleship is. It's always done with an apprenticement, an apprenticee, or a discipler, disciplee sort of relationship. Discipleship isn't a manual. It's done in the context of relationship, and we do that by walking with them. And so we talked, actually toward the end of class, we focused a little bit on some of the ways that we can walk with people, some of the challenges that come with that, and some tips about how to do that. So if you remember back, that's what we talked about, I think, on the very first day. And if you now are watching this at the end of class, you probably can see that we touched on all those topics. And hopefully you saw it all come together. And if you hadn't until now, there you go. We then focused a little bit more time on the history of youth ministry, and we started all the way back in Jewish culture and Deuteronomy. Talked about the role of parents and the Jewish view of youth and young people in the Old Testament and in that culture, up into how children are looked at in the New Testament, that there was also an early idea in the early church that children were innocent, and because of that, and many times were overlooked. But then with the era in theology coming from Augustine, with original sin and depravity, that children in some ways were still looked at as innocent, but there was a concern about really young people, even infants and children, and where they stood in regard to their sin and their salvation. And so this brought in ideas like infant baptism. And these theological concepts have a significant impact on the way that the church has looked at young people through the history of Christianity. Then we talked a little bit about the Middle Ages and the Reformation. And probably most importantly, when people talk about youth ministry, they look at the 19th century and the advent of the Sunday school movement, and how that was brought on by and large by the Industrial Revolution, which forced people to cities and to long work hours that didn't have any seasons. And because of this, children really had a lot of needs that weren't being taken care of. And so different organizations started to rise up to help children with literacy. And then in some ways, if they were becoming literate, oftentimes these were being incorporated with the literacy of the Bible. And so a specific focus on teaching youth apart from, not apart, but in conjunction with the parents. Oftentimes they were at work or weren't able to do this. This was provided by an outside group of people, like in the Sunday school movement. And so you have a specific focus on youth. But I did mention that when people study youth ministry, they often just say, well, let's go ahead and look in the 1840s, 1850s, and then maybe the advent of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Those are the kind of real places that we need to look for youth ministry. And those they're absolutely correct, but often they leave out all of the important history and philosophy that precedes that, upon which those eras were built, and in some ways needed to correct and come around. So we talked about the history of youth ministry. We also talked about theology. This class is about the philosophy and theology of youth ministry. And so we looked at theology, and what does that have to do with youth ministry? And I walked us through a couple important areas of theology, being biblical studies, church history, systematic theology, and most importantly for the study of youth ministry, practical theology. In practical theology, what I said is really the doorway by which we can deliver a deep theological understanding of God and the Bible and of life. But this happens through practical theology, which is usually what we run into in youth ministry. Practical theology is known for making the most of the things that come up in real life. It comes up through the crises and the problems and the challenges and the hurt and the pain that we all face. And practical theology is a discipline that allows us to look at that and to understand that and to study culture and to study individuals and to listen really hard and to try to figure out how what God has to do with that. Basically, in one way to set it is it says we're not going to set an agenda. We're going to see what's already happening, or even maybe more importantly, what God is already doing and come around that. And that's the angle that practical theology has, and that's really the strength of youth ministry, and when youth ministry is done really well. Sitting down to cover, for instance, let's study anthropology and hamartiology and bibliology and soteriology and every other ology. There is some value there, but you will probably lose a lot of young people, a lot of people in general. But if you start with the real pains, hurts, challenges, questions that young people have, that teenagers have, then you can open the door to look at the rich resources that we have throughout church history for what theology is. Then we talked about youth culture, and we watched a documentary. It's a little dated, The Merchants of Cool, but the concepts are still the same, which is that there's a gigantic industry out there that wants to make money on young people because they spend a lot of money. And they spend it in pretty dumb ways sometimes. And so they've capitalized on how to make money. And in that documentary, it had some really good snapshots of different groups and companies that look at young people and just basically try to milk it for all it's worth. And so that there's a whole industry there that we need to be aware of, which is a strategy to sell and make money off of young people. And this happens also in Christendom. This happens with Christian organizations that try to do that with young people too, as one of our guest speakers came in and helped us see that there's a backside to that as well that maybe not everyone knows about. We also talked about adolescent development. Like I said, that it begins in biology and ends in culture and in the experience of independence. And that there also are independent choices that people make, that teenagers make about faith and church involvement. We looked quite a bit at that in the latest statistics about why 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that there's a large dip in church attendance, and the reasons why that is. Some of the ideological reasons, these are things that I don't agree with or I have feelings about. And just some of the practical reasons for people, especially in their 20s, that make it difficult to really be engaged with church in a consistent basis. And then about some solutions and ideas about how to enter into those challenges. We also took, I think it was 2 classes to read through in Augustine's Confessions. And there's a book in there. A book it's made up of multiple books, is Confessions. Older books are like that. They're made up of multiple books. And it has a whole book on his 16th year. And we read the whole thing. And it had wonderful insights into his experience with culture, with his friends, with his own sin. And it showed us that though we're here in 21st century, that back in the 5th century, or at the end of the 4th century, that Augustine was going through very similar experiences. And so some of these are not just our own culture today, but they are a common experience of people in their teenage years. Then toward the end of class, we started to look a little bit more at some practical considerations. We worked on a way to share the gospel and understand that in a pretty succinct way. We also looked at some different approaches to youth ministries and how you would build them up in the church. And there's an inside-out model, and there's an outside-in model. We talked about relational and incarnational ministry. We talked about some of the challenges that come with those, which there can be a lot of challenges, and we talked about some practical tips about how to do relational and incarnational ministry, whether it's with students that you already know inside of the church, or whether it's with students who you've never met that don't go to church and you're meeting them outside the walls of the church. Last, we looked at how to make some plans for the youth group, for yourself, and what you might do on a weekly basis, what your group might do on a monthly basis, and even on an annual basis, and how to organize around that, all the while trying to meet and fall underneath the purposes that you set for the youth group and the objectives that you then set, so that at the end of the day, and you do a year review or a quarterly review, have we been able to do the things that we thought we would do? That we might have a great purpose like the glory of God, or we make disciples, but then you could identify specific objectives and things and say, here's how some progress that we made, here's where we could put some more focus, and we know exactly what to do. So really, that was in a nutshell, many of the things that we went through for class this semester. Last thing I want to mention is our final assignment. I have just a screenshot of it there, but if you go into the class, you can download this document, and what this is a template where you can fill in the details of it. I do want to warn you, and I warned you in class, that there is a word count on that, and when I've looked at this, I'd be very surprised if anyone could be able to hit all of the things that the assignment's asking for in the word count. This is a benchmark assignment, and with that, we can't alter or change any of the expectations for it. So when it's asking for 7 to 10 pieces of evidence of this, and 7 to 10 or pieces of evidence with it for something else, with the support to back it up and the citations, all of which we've been pulling up all through class, most of this information shouldn't be new, or you won't have to do too much new research. It should really just be compiling things you've been working on all semester. But when you compile all of that together, there's a good chance that this will be a rather long assignment. With that, if you go over, that is okay if it is quality information. If you go over with information that's not pertinent to make your point, to accomplish your thesis, to what the purpose of the paper is, if it goes on and on just kind of preaching or things like that, it's not going to help you. Just being long is not going to help you. That will hurt you. But if it's hitting the objectives that are set out in the template and they're set out in the assignment description,